My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my life, I was known as the easy one in my family. Not the favorite, not the rebel, just the one who didn't create problems. I was the son who adjusted, the brother who stepped back, the person everyone felt comfortable relying on, because I never made them uncomfortable in return. If you asked my family who I was back then, they would have said I was calm, practical, and dependable. Someone who understood how things were. Someone who didn't need much attention. Someone who would be fine. And for a long time, I believed that description myself. What they didn't notice, and what I barely understood at the time, was that being underestimated slowly becomes a role you're expected to perform. You don't announce it. No one says it out loud. It simply settles into place, like furniture that's been in the room so long, no one questions why it's there. I learned early that silence kept things smooth, that flexibility was rewarded more than honesty, that being useful earned appreciation faster than being fully seen. So I stayed observant. I listened. I remembered. I told myself that this was just how families worked. This story isn't about blame, and it isn't about revenge. There's no dramatic confrontation where everything spills out at once. There's no single villain here. My parents loved in the ways they knew how. My siblings grew into roles that benefited them. None of this was planned. It was normalized. What this story is about is the slow accumulation of clarity. It's about what happens when small dismissals repeat often enough that you stop questioning them, and then one day, quietly start questioning yourself. It's about realizing that being the reliable one can sometimes mean being taken for granted. And it's about the moment you understand that staying silent is no longer neutral, it's a choice. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to tell you how I moved from quiet endurance to quiet control. Not by raising my voice, not by humiliating anyone, but by paying attention, documenting patterns, and eventually choosing a path that didn't require anyone else's permission. There's no triumph music in this story, no victory speech, just a series of decisions made without anger and without apology. If you've ever felt like your value in your family depended on how easy you were to deal with, if you've ever noticed that your absence would cause inconvenience but not concern, if you've ever felt guilty for wanting distance even when you couldn't explain why, then you may recognize parts of yourself in what I'm about to share. I'm telling this story not to reopen old wounds, but to give language to something many people feel and rarely say out loud. That sometimes the most powerful shift doesn't come from confrontation, but from withdrawal with clarity. So before we go any further, let me ask you one quiet question. No judgment, no pressure. Have you ever wondered what might change if you stopped being the easiest person for everyone else and started being honest with yourself? To my family, I was dependable in a way that almost felt abstract. I wasn't the person they worried about. I wasn't the one whose choices sparked debate at dinner or whose name came up in hushed side conversations. When my parents talked about the future, my siblings' lives came with concern, pride, or frustration. Mine came with certainty. Ethan will manage. Ethan will figure it out. Ethan doesn't need help. That assumption followed me everywhere. At family gatherings, I was the one who arrived early and left when the dishes were done. If someone needed help moving furniture, setting up electronics, fixing a car issue, or mediating a disagreement, my name came up casually, never ceremoniously. I wasn't asked if I had the time. It was simply understood that I would make time. And I usually did. Not because I felt obligated, at least not consciously. I told myself I liked being useful. That contribution made me part of the group. That reliability was its own kind of respect. Looking back, I can see how that belief formed early, reinforced quietly, and never really challenged. My parents often described me as mature for my age. What they meant was that I didn't demand emotional energy. I didn't push back when decisions were made without me. I accepted thin explanations and apologies that never arrived. When something didn't feel fair, I convinced myself fairness wasn't the point. My siblings saw me as steady background support, the kind of person whose presence you feel only when it's gone. If they were stressed, they vented to me. If they needed backup, I was there. If they succeeded, I celebrated quietly from the side. I wasn't resentful about it at the time. I thought this was just the natural order of things. The strange part is that no one ever said I was less important. They didn't have to. Importance is revealed in patterns, not statements. Who gets consulted? In whose preferences shape plans? In whose absence causes discomfort versus concern? Over time, I noticed that my role was functional, not central. I was infrastructure, necessary but invisible. When family photos were taken, I stood wherever there was space. When holidays were planned, dates were chosen first, and I adjusted my schedule afterward. When conflicts arose, I was expected to understand both sides and quietly absorb the tension so others didn't have to. I became very good at reading the room. I knew when to speak, and when silence would be interpreted as maturity. I knew which opinions would be dismissed and which would create unnecessary friction. I learned to deliver agreement in a tone that sounded thoughtful, even when I hadn't been included in the decision. And here's the part that's hard to admit. I participated in my own invisibility. Every time I minimized my needs, I reinforced the version of me that everyone else relied on. Every time I stayed calm instead of honest, I taught them what to expect. There was no single moment when I was pushed aside. It was more subtle than that. 1,000 small adjustments, each one reasonable on its own. From the outside, my life looked stable. I had a job, paid my bills, and showed up when needed. Family members often used me as a comparison point. "Why can't you be more like Ethan?" they'd say. To someone else, never to me. I was a standard, not a person, and standards don't get checked on, they get used. At the time, I didn't feel angry. I felt fixed in place. Like my role had been set, and deviating from it would require an explanation I didn't yet have the words for. So I stayed where I was, quietly convincing myself that this was what loyalty looked like. But even then, long before anything changed, I was noticing things. I noticed how quickly conversations moved on when I spoke about myself. I noticed how my sacrifices were remembered as expectations, not choices. I noticed that when I stopped volunteering information, no one asked follow-up questions. I noticed. I just didn't act on it yet. The first small cut didn't come with raised voices or harsh words. It didn't even happen during an argument. That's what made it so easy for everyone else to miss, and so hard for me to forget. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind my family liked to treat as informal but meaningful. We were gathered at my parents' house for a late lunch. Nothing special, no holiday. Just enough of us in one place to remind everyone who played which role. I remember standing in the kitchen, helping my mother clear plates while the rest of the family settled into the living room. My father and siblings were already deep in conversation, planning something I hadn't realized was on the table. A decision had been made while I was still scraping dishes. They were talking about rearranging the family's financial support for the year. Nothing dramatic, just logistics. Who would help whom? Who needed flexibility? Who deserved understanding because they were going through a lot? My name came up briefly. "Ethan will be fine," my father said, without looking up from his coffee. It wasn't dismissive. It was casual, certain. That sentence landed quietly, like a door closing somewhere behind me. I remember drying my hands slowly, giving myself time before rejoining the room. When I did, the conversation didn't pause. No one asked what I thought. No one explained the decision. It had already moved on to something else. A vacation idea, I think. Someone laughed, and I smiled, automatically. At the time, I told myself it wasn't worth mentioning, that it wasn't personal, that families make these choices all the time. I reminded myself that I didn't need the support being discussed, that being capable meant not requiring reassurance. But something about that moment stayed with me. It wasn't the outcome, it was the assumption. The way my stability had been converted into silence. The way my presence was treated as optional input, but guaranteed compliance. I realized, standing there, that my role didn't include being consulted, it included being accounted for. There's a difference. For the rest of the afternoon, I played my part. I helped refill drinks. I listened. I contributed at the edges. No one noticed anything was off, because nothing was off, on the surface. But internally, a small recalibration had begun. I replayed that sentence later that night. "Ethan will be fine." It wasn't unkind. It wasn't inaccurate. And yet, it carried weight. It implied that my capacity disqualified me from consideration, that my reliability exempted others from responsibility toward me, that being okay meant being overlooked. Over the next few weeks, I noticed how often that same logic appeared in different forms. When plans changed at the last minute, I was informed, not asked. When resources were divided, my share was decided by absence. When emotional support was needed, I was available, but rarely reciprocated. None of it was aggressive enough to protest. That's what made it effective. I considered bringing it up once. I even rehearsed the words in my head, something neutral, non-accusatory. But each time, I stopped myself. I didn't want to sound sensitive. I didn't want to disrupt the balance. And if I was honest, I wasn't entirely sure I could explain why it bothered me without sounding ungrateful. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. But quiet doesn't mean untouched. That small cut changed the way I listened. I started paying attention not just to what was said, but to what was assumed. I noticed how often decisions were framed as necessities rather than choices. How frequently my understanding was treated as a given. And I began to understand something unsettling. My silence wasn't being respected, it was being relied upon. The cut was small, invisible, easy to dismiss, but it was precise. And once you feel something like that, you can't unfeel it. After that Sunday afternoon, nothing changed on the surface. There was no fallout, no tension, no apology, because none was expected. Life continued exactly as it always had, which, in hindsight, was the point. The moment didn't matter enough to anyone else to require adjustment. To them, everything was still working. To me, it began to feel rehearsed. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing its variations everywhere. Small things, ordinary things. Each one is easy to excuse, but together they form something heavier than intention alone. I noticed how often conversations about family plans happened around me instead of with me. I would hear about decisions after they were already set, usually framed as updates rather than invitations. "We figured you'd be okay with it," someone would say. And I would nod, because technically, I was. That's how it normalized. Being okay became my default response, not because I always was, but because I'd learned it was expected. Over time, my internal reactions became quieter, shorter, and easier to dismiss. I told myself that pushing back would be selfish, that harmony mattered more than preference. Those families worked because someone stayed flexible, that someone was usually me. When my siblings needed support, financial, emotional, logistical, it was discussed openly, almost ceremoniously. Their struggles were contextualized. Their stress was named. Mine was implied to be manageable, and therefore unremarkable. If I mentioned being tired, it was brushed off as temporary. If I expressed frustration, it was reframed as stress. There was always an explanation that didn't require action. And I accepted those explanations because I didn't yet have a framework for anything else. The most subtle part was how praise was used. I was often thanked for being understanding, complimented for being low drama. Occasionally, it is even held up as an example of emotional maturity. Those words sounded positive, but they came with a quiet expectation attached. Don't change. Every time I met that expectation, the role hardened. I started to notice that when I didn't immediately agree, there was a brief pause, a recalibration in the room. Not anger, confusion, as if my hesitation was a technical error that needed smoothing over. Someone would fill the silence quickly, offer a rationale, or gently steer me back toward agreement, and I would let them. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was afraid of being misunderstood, of being labeled difficult after years of being dependable. That kind of identity shift carries risk, especially in families where roles feel permanent. So I rationalized. I told myself that my family didn't mean to dismiss me, that they were under pressure, that my adaptability was a strength, that I didn't need the same kind of validation as others because I was more self-sufficient. All of that was partially true. But partial truths can still do damage. The more I normalized the pattern, the more invisible it became. Not just to them, but to me. I stopped checking in with my own reactions. I started pre-editing my thoughts before speaking, filtering out anything that might slow things down or complicate the moment. I became efficient. Efficient at support, efficient at understanding, efficient at self-erasure, and efficiency, when applied to emotional life, comes at a cost. Mashiti. There was a point when I realized that no one in my family could accurately describe what I wanted. Not because they didn't care, but because I rarely stated it, and when I did, it was often overridden by something deemed more urgent. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. I started observing how respect functioned in the family. Who got it by default, who had to earn it, and who, like me, had accidentally traded it for stability. I noticed that the more reliable someone is, the less often they're protected. Their resilience becomes a justification. Their silence becomes permission. Their consistency becomes background noise. And the worst part? No one has to be cruel for this to happen. It happens because it's convenient, because it works, because the person absorbing the imbalance doesn't protest loudly enough to disrupt the system. By then, I had years of practice. I knew how to stay composed. I knew how to smooth over awkwardness. I knew how to be the person others leaned on without ever leaning back. And I kept telling myself that this was temporary, that eventually someone would notice, that eventually my steadiness would be met with care instead of assumption. But deep down, I was beginning to understand something I hadn't been ready to name before. Nothing changes in a system that rewards your silence. It wasn't given to me in words. No one sat me down and explained who I was supposed to be in the family. There was no conversation, no agreement. The role was assigned the same way most family roles are, through repetition, reinforcement, and relief. I was the one who could be counted on, not in a heroic way, in a practical one. If something needed handling, I handled it. If a situation needed smoothing, I smoothed it. If there was discomfort in the room, I absorbed it quietly so others wouldn't have to. Over time, that reliability stopped being appreciated as effort and started being treated as a function. I was no longer someone who helped. I was someone who was used to helping. That distinction matters, because once a role becomes functional, it stops being questioned. People don't check in with the chair they always sit on. They don't thank the light switch for working. They assume availability because availability has never failed them. I realized my role fully the day a family disagreement broke out, one that didn't involve me at all. Two relatives were arguing over a decision that affected everyone. Voices were raised. Emotions were spilling over. I sat there listening, not intervening, not choosing sides. Eventually, someone turned to me and said, "Ethan, you're good at seeing both sides. What do you think we should do?" It sounded like respect. It wasn't. It was a delegation. They weren't asking for my opinion. They were asking me to stabilize the situation so they wouldn't have to sit with the discomfort. And when I offered a measured, balanced response, something careful, something designed to calm, the tension eased. Everyone nodded. The argument softened. And the decision went exactly where it had been headed before I spoke. That's when it became clear. My role wasn't to influence outcomes, it was to reduce friction. I was the emotional buffer, the translator, the stabilizer. I existed to make sure conflict never escalated to the point where real accountability was required. My presence allowed others to move forward without examining their behavior too closely. And the more I fulfilled that role, the more essential and invisible I became. I started noticing how often I was praised after I made things easier. "I don't know what we'd do without you," someone would say, or "You're the glue that holds us together." Those words sound meaningful, but glue doesn't get a say in where things go. It just holds what's already there. I also noticed how little space there was for me to need anything. If I was struggling, the room wouldn't open. It tightened. People grew uncomfortable, offered quick fixes, or changed the subject. My vulnerability disrupted the function I served, so it was subtly discouraged, not through cruelty, but through avoidance. And I adapted. I became more controlled, more measured, more selective about what I shared. I kept my life compartmentalized so it wouldn't interfere with the role I was expected to play. In doing so, I protected the family dynamic, but at the expense of my own visibility within it. There was a quiet grief in that realization. Not because I wanted to be the center of attention, but because I understood that the version of me my family depended on didn't leave room for growth, or change, or dissent. They didn't need me. They needed the role. And roles don't get to evolve unless the system around them is willing to adapt. Mine wasn't. I didn't confront anyone about it. I didn't announce my discomfort. I didn't demand recognition. At that point, I wasn't ready. But something inside me shifted from endurance to awareness. I stopped assuming my place was neutral. I started seeing it as conditional, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no moment where anyone else in my family noticed a change. If you had been there, you would have thought it was an ordinary day, one that looked exactly like all the others. That's often how real turning points happen. It was a weekday evening, quiet in the way only familiar routines can be. I had stopped by my parents' house after work to drop something off. I wasn't planning to stay long. Just a brief visit, a few minutes of conversation, then back to my own life. While I was there, a conversation unfolded in the background, my siblings discussing a situation that had been ongoing for months. A mix of frustration, excuses, and unresolved responsibility. I listened from the kitchen, not participating, already anticipating how it would end. And I was right. Eventually, someone said, "Ethan will help with that. He always knows how to handle these things." No one asked me. No one even looked in my direction. The decision slid into place with such ease that it was almost elegant, natural, efficient. It was treated as a solution, not an imposition. And in that moment, something in me went very still. I realized I could already feel my response forming. The automatic yes, the mental rearranging of my schedule, the quiet acceptance that would follow. I knew exactly how this scene usually played out, but instead of stepping in, I stayed where I was. I kept washing the glass in my hand, listening to the water run. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't announce my discomfort. I just noticed. For the first time, I let the moment exist without immediately resolving it. That was the shift. It wasn't anger that stopped me. It was clarity. I saw how easily my time, energy, and emotional labor were allocated without consultation. I saw how my reliability had become communal property. And I understood very clearly that nothing external was forcing this pattern to continue. I was. By always saying yes. By always stepping in. By always smoothing things over before the discomfort could teach anyone anything. Standing there, I asked myself a question I had never asked honestly before. What would happen if I didn't respond the way they expected? The answer wasn't catastrophic. No one would be harmed. No relationship would instantly collapse. The only thing at risk was the role I'd been playing. And that realization felt grounding. When I eventually walked back into the room, the conversation had moved on. The decision had been made in theory, but not yet enacted. Someone mentioned it again, casually, as if reminding me of a task I'd already agreed to. This time I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I said, "I'll think about it." The room didn't react strongly. There was a pause, short, almost imperceptible. Then someone nodded and said, "Okay," and the conversation shifted. That was all. No confrontation, no explanation, no justification. But inside me, something had realigned. For the rest of that evening, I felt unusually present, not tense, aware. I noticed how often I had filled space out of habit. How rarely I had allowed uncertainty to sit unresolved. How much of my identity had been built around immediate accommodation. On the drive home, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. And that calm wasn't relief, it was recognition. I recognized that silence could be a boundary, that delay could be a decision. Not reacting was sometimes the most honest response available. Nothing in my family changed that day. But I did. And once that internal shift happens, the external world has no choice but to catch up, eventually. After that evening, I didn't announce any changes. I didn't explain myself. I didn't set new rules or have difficult conversations. From the outside, everything probably looked the same, but internally, my silence had shifted from habit to intention. Before, I stayed quiet because it felt expected, because speaking up seemed unnecessary or disruptive. Now, when I chose not to respond immediately, it was deliberate. I was no longer managing the room, I was watching it. The first thing I noticed was how uncomfortable uncertainty made people. When I didn't immediately agree, others stepped in to fill the gap. They offered justifications. They softened the language. They reassured themselves out loud that things would work out. My silence, which used to function as a lubricant, had become friction, and they didn't like it. I began taking longer to respond to requests, not dramatically, just enough to interrupt the pattern. A message left unanswered for a few hours, a vague acknowledgement instead of an immediate commitment. Let me check, instead of course. Each small pause revealed something new. I saw how often my availability had been assumed, not requested, how rarely alternatives were considered until I didn't immediately comply. It became clear that my silence wasn't interpreted as thoughtfulness, it was interpreted as resistance, and resistance made people uneasy. Some family members responded by becoming overly accommodating. They checked in more often and explained themselves more thoroughly. Others reacted by minimizing my hesitation. "It's not a big deal," they'd say, or "we'll figure it out later." The common thread was the same. They were adjusting to regain equilibrium. No one asked me directly what had changed. That, too, was revealing. It was easier for them to adapt to my behavior than to confront the possibility that my role was shifting. Acknowledging that would require revisiting assumptions that had been comfortable for years. I noticed how quickly my silence was reinterpreted as mood. If I didn't engage, I must be tired. If I declined to help, I must be stressed. There was always an explanation that preserved the old narrative. Ethan is fine, just busy. And I let them believe it. Because I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't trying to provoke insight. I was gathering information. I wanted to see what happened when I stopped smoothing things over. When I allowed minor inconveniences to remain unresolved. When I didn't step in to translate, mediate, or stabilize. What happened was instructive. Other people had to carry the weight they'd grown used to handing me. Decisions took longer. Tension lingered. Miscommunications weren't immediately repaired. Nothing collapsed, but nothing moved as efficiently either. And slowly, subtly, I felt something shift in how I was perceived. I wasn't less respected. I was less predictable. That distinction mattered. Predictability had been the foundation of my invisibility. Once removed, people had to reassess, not consciously but behaviorally. They began asking instead of assuming, framing requests instead of issuing updates. The change was small but consistent. I didn't reward it with explanations. I stayed calm, polite, unreactive. Silence, I realized, was powerful not because it confused people, but because it forced them to reveal themselves. In the absence of my usual responses, others showed me how much they had relied on them. There were moments of guilt. I'd be lying if I said there weren't. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I felt the pull to step in, to restore ease, to return to the version of me that made everything smoother, but I didn't. Not out of spite, but out of respect for myself. For the first time, my silence wasn't about keeping the peace. It was about keeping my center. And in that space, quiet, unresolved, slightly uncomfortable, I began to see the shape of what came next. While everyone was adjusting to my new quiet, something else was happening, something far less visible. I was preparing. Not in the dramatic sense. I wasn't plotting exits or rehearsing confrontations. There was no countdown, no secret plan waiting for the right moment. What I was doing was slower, more deliberate, and easy to miss because it looked like nothing at all. I was paying attention with a different purpose. For years, I had absorbed family patterns without recording them. I remembered conversations, but I didn't organize them. I felt an imbalance, but I didn't define it. Now I started doing both. I began writing things down, not emotionally, factually. Dates, decisions, who asked, who assumed, who benefited, who absorbed the cost. It wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about removing doubt from my own mind. I wanted to know whether what I felt was real or just sensitivity amplified by fatigue. Patterns don't argue back. Once I started documenting them, the story became clearer. The same names appeared in the same roles. The same responsibilities flowed in the same direction. My contributions were expected. My limits were treated as temporary obstacles to work around. What surprised me wasn't how often it happened, but how rarely it was acknowledged. At the same time, I quietly strengthened areas of my life that had nothing to do with my family. I reviewed my finances more carefully, simplified my obligations, reduced shared dependencies I had previously accepted out of convenience. If something tied me to the family system, I examined whether it was necessary or just habitual. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't need to. I was building optionality. I learned more about boundaries, not the performative kind that comes with speeches and ultimatums, but the structural kind, the kind that exist, whether or not anyone agrees with them. Financial autonomy, time ownership, emotional non-reactivity. I stopped over-explaining my choices, stopped justifying my availability. If I declined something, I did it cleanly, briefly, without apology. That alone altered how requests were framed. And still, no one noticed what I was doing. They couldn't. Preparation, when done quietly, looks like indifference. While family members speculated about my mood or workload, I was studying leverage, not power over others, but power over my own position. I asked myself uncomfortable questions. What do I actually owe? What have I been giving out of habit rather than choice? What would happen if I stopped? The answers weren't dramatic. They were freeing. I also paid attention to language. How often was my help described as generosity versus responsibility? How frequently were others' struggles framed as temporary, but mine as manageable? Words revealed expectations that actions had long concealed. I noticed that when I wasn't immediately available, solutions appeared. Other people stepped in. Resources were found. The system adapted, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably, which meant something important. I had never been indispensable. I had just been convenient. That realization wasn't painful. It was clarifying. It meant I wasn't abandoning anyone by stepping back. I was simply allowing the system to rebalance without me carrying the extra weight. And here's what they never noticed most of all. I wasn't withdrawing emotionally. I was withdrawing strategically. I still showed up, still listened, still cared. But I no longer positioned myself as the solution. I let gaps remain, let silence do its work, let others experience the consequences of decisions made without my input. All of this happened without confrontation, without declarations, without drama. From their perspective, nothing significant was changing. From mine, everything was. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't hoping to be seen. I wasn't preparing to explain myself. I was preparing to move, internally first. And once that kind of preparation begins, the outcome stops being a question of if, only when. The private reveal didn't come from a conversation. No one confessed anything. No truth was dramatically exposed. It came from alignment. One evening, after another routine family interaction that left no visible mark, I sat alone at home and reviewed the notes I'd been keeping. Not with frustration, but with distance. Enough time had passed that emotion had thinned out. What remained was structure, and structure tells the truth more reliably than memory. I could see it clearly now. The imbalance wasn't situational. It wasn't about timing, stress, or misunderstanding. It was systemic. My role wasn't being misused. It was being used exactly as designed. The realization landed quietly, but it was complete. I understood then that nothing I had experienced required malice to function. No one needed to intend harm. The system rewarded my silence and penalized my visibility. That alone was enough to keep it running. And here was the private part, the part no one else could see. I finally understood where my leverage was, not in confrontation, not in withholding affection, not in exposing anyone. My leverage was absence, not disappearance, but withdrawal of function. I realized that my value in the family dynamic had never been emotional closeness. It had been reliable. Consistency. My willingness to absorb friction and resolve discomfort before it spreads. Which meant that if I stopped doing those things, calmly, cleanly, without resentment, the system would feel it immediately. And I also realized something else, just as important. I didn't need to prove anything. I didn't need validation. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't need an apology. Those things would only tie my sense of resolution to their awareness. And I was done handing that power away. The reveal wasn't painful, it was relieving. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was being unfair, whether I was too sensitive, whether I should just try harder to communicate. The answer was no. Communication hadn't been missing. Consent had. I had never agreed to be the emotional infrastructure of the family. I had simply adapted to it. And once I saw that clearly, the guilt began to dissolve. Guilt relies on ambiguity. Clarity removes it. I sat with that clarity for a while, not rushing to act, not planning the next step, just letting the truth settle without urgency. There was no adrenaline, no excitement, just a steady calm. Because once you see leverage for what it is, you don't rush to use it. You decide how. I also understood that whatever came next would be irreversible, not because it would damage relationships, but because it would permanently change how I saw them. You can't unknow what you know. You can't return to unconscious participation once awareness has set in. That night, I didn't sleep poorly. I slept deeply. The kind of sleep that comes when you're no longer negotiating with yourself. By morning, nothing in my external life had changed, but internally, the decision-making process had shifted from reaction to authorship. I wasn't waiting to see what would happen. I already knew. The reveal wasn't about discovering someone else's behavior. It was about reclaiming my own position. And from that moment on, every action I took would come from clarity, not obligation. Clarity creates options, and options demand a decision. Once I understood my leverage, I didn't act immediately. I let the awareness sit long enough to see what paths were actually available to me, not the dramatic ones, but the realistic ones. I needed to be honest about what each choice would cost, not just emotionally, but structurally. There were 3 paths. The first was to speak up, to articulate everything I had observed, to explain how the pattern had affected me and ask for a change. On the surface, it seemed reasonable, healthy even. But I knew my family well enough to understand what would happen next. There would be defensiveness, even if unintentional. Explanations framed as context. A flurry of short-term effort followed by gradual regression. The system would bend, apologize, promise, and then quietly reassert itself once the discomfort passed. That path required constant maintenance. And I was tired of maintenance. The second path was to stay exactly where I was, aware but still participating. To hold my clarity privately and continue contributing in controlled doses. This option offered stability, familiarity, and minimal disruption. But it also required me to remain in a role I no longer believed in. Awareness without action isn't peace. It's restraint. And over time, restraint becomes resentment. The third path was the quiet one. To stop centering myself in the system without announcing it. To remove my reliability as a default setting. To live in a way that no longer required me to be managed, anticipated, or depended upon. This path didn't involve confrontation. It involved reallocation of time, of energy, of presence. It meant choosing myself without asking anyone else to agree. It meant allowing relationships to recalibrate or fade based on who I was when I stopped performing my old function. That was the irreversible option, not because it was aggressive, but because it was final. Once I chose it, there would be no dramatic moment to mark the shift, no argument to point back to, no apology to accept or reject, just a gradual, undeniable change in how available I was, and therefore, how necessary I seemed. I considered what I owed my family. Gratitude? Yes. Respect? Of course. Endless accommodation? No. I also considered what I owed myself. Consistency, autonomy, honesty. The decision came quietly, without ceremony. I chose the third path. Not because it was easier, but because it was clean. I didn't tell anyone I had chosen it. There was no announcement, no boundary-setting speech. Those things often invite negotiation, and I wasn't interested in negotiating my clarity. Instead, I let my behavior do the talking. I declined more often. I disengaged sooner. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't expressed. And most importantly, I stopped explaining why. I didn't disappear. I didn't punish. I didn't withdraw affection. I simply stopped positioning myself as the answer. That choice reshaped everything that followed. Because once you remove yourself as the stabilizing force, systems reveal their true balance, or lack of it. And from that point forward, every consequence would be a result of dynamics that had existed long before I ever noticed them. I had made my decision. Now, I was going to move in silence. Once the decision was made, the hardest part was restraint. Not acting dramatically, not explaining, not correcting assumptions in real time. I had to let the shift unfold naturally, without forcing it into a narrative my family could immediately react to. Silence, at this stage, wasn't avoidance. It was strategy. I began by changing how I structured my time. I stopped building my schedule around potential family needs. I made plans without preemptively leaving space just in case. When something conflicted, I didn't rearrange my life to accommodate it. I chose what was already on my calendar. That alone altered the rhythm. Requests that once flowed smoothly now met resistance. Not because I refused them outright, but because I was no longer immediately available. "I can't that day" became a complete sentence. No follow-up, no alternative offered unless I genuinely wanted to. I also quietly untangled shared responsibilities. There were financial overlaps I'd accepted years earlier out of convenience and loyalty. I resolved them methodically, paying off what needed to be closed, transferring what needed to be transferred, documenting everything cleanly. No announcements, no drama. From the outside, it looked like adulthood. From the inside, it was independence. Emotionally, I shifted too. I stopped mediating conflicts that didn't involve me. If two family members were misaligned, I didn't step in to translate or soothe. I listened if asked, but I didn't resolve. I allowed conversations to end unfinished. That made people uncomfortable. Silence has weight when it replaces a function people rely on. At first, the discomfort manifested as confusion, subtle questions. "Are you okay? You seem busy lately," I answered honestly but briefly. I was fine. I was busy. Both were true. No one pressed further. They didn't sense danger, they sensed distance. And distance is easier to ignore until it isn't. I also became more intentional about what I shared. I stopped offering updates about my life unless asked. I didn't volunteer opinions unless invited. I didn't fill the silence with reassurance. This wasn't withdrawal. It was selectivity. I was still present, but no longer available by default. Behind the scenes, I took care of practical matters that would support this shift long-term. I reviewed legal documents, updated emergency contacts, clarified expectations where ambiguity had once benefited others at my expense. Matabas. Nothing extreme, nothing hostile, just alignment. And still, no one noticed. Not really. That's the nature of silent movement. It doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't provoke an immediate response. People adapt just enough to maintain comfort until the absence becomes unavoidable. I was careful not to rush that process. If I had changed too much, too fast, it would have forced a conversation. And conversations have a way of redirecting responsibility back to the person who initiates them. I wanted the system to feel the shift on its own. So I stayed steady, calm, consistent. I didn't match frustration with defensiveness. I didn't respond to guilt with an explanation. I didn't fill gaps that others had grown used to ignoring. And slowly, the consequences began to surface. Not dramatically, not publicly, but unmistakably. Some family members grew uneasy. They sensed the shift, but didn't know how to address it. Others adapted pragmatically, redistributing responsibilities without commentary. A few tried to re-establish the old dynamic through subtle guilt, reminders of how things used to work, references to shared history, appeals to loyalty. I didn't argue with any of it. I simply maintained my position. When guilt was offered, I acknowledged it without accepting it. When nostalgia was used as leverage, I treated it as memory, not obligation. I stayed calm, consistent, and unavailable to manipulation. That consistency did more than any explanation could have. It taught people where I stood. The system began to show strain, not because I had left, but because it had been relying on me more than it realized. And now, without my quiet corrections, cracks became visible. Decisions led to consequences. Emotions went unbuffered. Conflicts lasted longer, and still no one confronted me directly. That was the most telling part. It was easier for them to feel the discomfort than to examine the structure that had caused it. To acknowledge that would require acknowledging how much they had depended on my silence. I watched all of this without satisfaction or regret. There was no pleasure in being missed, only confirmation. Confirmation that my presence had been functional, not relational. That my withdrawal didn't create chaos, but it did reveal imbalance. And in that revelation, something else began to happen. Respect. Not admiration. Not praise. Adjustment. People recalibrated how they approached me. They asked more clearly. They accepted refusals more readily. They stopped assuming I would catch what fell through the cracks. The consequences were doing their work. Quietly. Naturally. Without me having to say a word. By the time my family realized something was wrong, the pattern had already changed. That's the thing about slow shifts. They don't announce themselves. They settle in. They rewrite expectations quietly, until one day, someone looks around and realizes the ground feels different under their feet. The first real sign came as concern, not accusation. Someone asked me, gently, if everything was okay between us. The question wasn't specific. It didn't name anything concrete. It was an attempt to restore a feeling, not address a structure. I answered honestly. I said I was fine, and I was. That answer unsettled them more than a complaint would have, because complaints can be addressed. They create tasks, conversations, and action items. But calm is harder to work with, especially when it doesn't invite negotiation. After that, efforts were made. Invitations became more frequent. Check-ins are more deliberate. A few apologies surfaced, not for anything specific, but for being busy or assuming too much. The tone suggested repair, but the approach remained surface level. They were trying to bring me back without changing the system. It was too late for that. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted distance, but because the version of me they were trying to reconnect with no longer existed. I could see the effort for what it was, well-intentioned, but incomplete. It focused on restoring closeness without addressing expectations, on smoothing over discomfort without redistributing responsibility, and I wasn't willing to return to that arrangement. When I accepted invitations, I stayed present, but I didn't resume my old role. I didn't mediate. I didn't manage. I didn't anticipate. I let silence exist where it once wouldn't have lasted more than a few seconds. That silence was uncomfortable. Conversations stalled. Plans remained vague. Emotional weight lingered longer than before. People waited for me to step in. And when I didn't, they noticed. I think that's when the realization hit. Not all at once, not for everyone, but enough. They started seeing the difference between presence and participation, between being there and being responsible. And for the first time, they understood that my involvement had always been a choice, not a trait. There were moments of regret. I saw it in the way people spoke more carefully around me, in the way they checked their words after making assumptions, in the way some conversations ended with an unspoken, "We should have noticed sooner," hanging in the air. But regret doesn't rewind time. It doesn't undo years of conditioning. It doesn't restore trust once awareness has changed. I wasn't punishing anyone by staying where I was. I was simply no longer willing to be reduced. At one point, someone suggested we talk things through, the way families often do when something feels off. It was offered kindly, but without specificity. A general reset. I declined. Not harshly, not defensively. I said, I don't think that would change anything. And I meant it, because what needed to change had already. The structure was different now. The expectations had shifted. I wasn't interested in revisiting old ground just to reassure others that everything could go back to normal. Normal hadn't worked for me, and by the time they understood that, it was already true. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no emotional surge waiting to be released. It happened quietly, almost reluctantly, as if everyone involved understood that this moment had been delayed for a long time, and that it couldn't be avoided anymore. It was a conversation with my parents. They asked me to come by one evening, just the three of us. The request was careful, almost formal. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I was ready to speak without defending myself. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so many decisions had been made without me over the years. The familiarity of it didn't trigger anything. It just grounded the moment. They didn't accuse me of pulling away. They said they felt it. That difference mattered. My father spoke first. He said things felt different lately, less connected. My mother followed, saying she worried she had missed something, that perhaps they had assumed too much, leaned too hard on my steadiness. They were close. I didn't rush to fill the silence. When I spoke, My voice was even, measured, not rehearsed. I didn't catalogue events. I didn't argue intent. I didn't explain how long I'd felt this way. I said something simple. I told them that for a long time, I had been valued for being easy rather than being seen. I had adapted to that because it kept things smooth, and that at some point, I realized I couldn't keep doing that without losing myself. There was no accusation in my tone, just a fact. They listened, really listened. I could see it in the way they didn't interrupt, in the way they didn't immediately explain themselves. My mother apologized, not defensively, not performatively. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd relied on my silence, that she thought she was respecting my independence, when in reality, she had been avoiding my needs. I accepted the apology, not as closure, but as acknowledgement. My father asked what I needed now. That was the moment I had been preparing for. I didn't say I needed a change from them. I didn't outline conditions or expectations. I didn't ask for a different kind of treatment. I said I needed them to understand that I would no longer automatically take on responsibility that wasn't mine, that my involvement would be intentional, that if something required my help, it needed to be asked, not assumed. There was a pause. Then my father nodded. He didn't promise perfection. He didn't claim sudden insight. He just said he understood, and that he would adjust. That was enough. The conversation ended without resolution in the traditional sense. No plan, no follow-up discussion scheduled, no emotional crescendo, just clarity. As I left that night, I didn't feel lighter or heavier. I felt aligned. The confrontation hadn't changed the past. It hadn't erased the pattern. But it had confirmed something important. I could speak without losing my calm. I could assert without aggression. I could be honest without trying to convince anyone. And that meant the work I'd done, internally, quietly, had been real. I didn't become a different person. That's the part people often misunderstand when they hear stories like this. They expect a transformation marked by confidence, assertiveness, maybe even distance. But what changed in me wasn't volume or attitude. It was orientation. I stopped facing outward by default. For most of my life, I had oriented myself toward maintaining equilibrium, reading others, anticipating needs, adjusting my position to keep things smooth. Now, my center was internal. Decisions passed through clarity before they passed through obligation. That changed everything. I still show up for my family. I still care. I still listen. But I no longer carry what doesn't belong to me. When something feels off, I don't rush to correct it. I let it exist long enough for everyone involved to feel its shape. That alone has altered how relationships function. I'm no longer the silent stabilizer. I'm a participant with limits. And limits, I've learned, don't weaken connection. They define it. There are moments when the old dynamic tries to resurface. Habits don't disappear overnight. Sometimes a request is framed as an assumption. Sometimes my pause is met with surprise. I respond calmly. Sometimes I say yes. Sometimes I say no. Sometimes I say I'll think about it, and actually do. What matters is that the choice is mine. I don't explain myself unless I want to. I don't soften my boundaries with apologies. I don't overcorrect when someone feels uncomfortable with my restraint. Discomfort isn't damage, it's information. And I've learned to respect it without rushing to eliminate it. The relationship with my parents is different now. Quieter, more deliberate. There's less ease, but more honesty. They ask more, assume less. Not because they were corrected, but because the system no longer rewards assumption. With my siblings, the distance fluctuates. Some adjusted easily, others struggled. That's okay. I don't chase alignment. I allow it to develop, or not, on its own terms. I don't feel guilty about that anymore. Because guilt requires a belief that I'm doing something wrong, and I'm not. I'm simply no longer over-functioning. The biggest change is internal. I trust my own reactions now. I don't second-guess discomfort. I don't rationalize patterns that drain me. I don't confuse loyalty with self-erasure. Quiet dominance, as I understand it now, isn't about control. It's about authorship. I author my time. I author my energy. I author my presence. And I allow others to respond to that however they choose. Some days, that means less closeness. Other days, it means a deeper connection. Both are honest. I no longer measure my value by how useful I am to others. I measure it by how aligned I am with myself. And that alignment has given me something I didn't know I was missing for years. Peace that doesn't depend on being needed. For a long time, I thought strength in a family meant endurance. It meant staying quiet when things felt uneven. It meant adapting faster than others. It meant being reliable enough that no one ever had to worry about you. What I didn't understand then is that endurance, without boundaries, slowly becomes self-erasure. This story isn't about cutting people off. It isn't about proving a point. And it isn't about demanding recognition from those who weren't ready to give it. It's about something much quieter and much more permanent. It's about choosing clarity over comfort. Families, like all systems, adjust to what they're given. If you consistently absorb the weight, the system learns to place it there, not out of cruelty, but out of efficiency. And efficiency, left unchecked, doesn't care who it drains. The moment things began to change for me wasn't when I spoke up. It was when I stopped compensating. When I allowed my absence to be felt without explaining it away. When I let discomfort teach what words never could. When I trusted that I didn't need permission to step out of a role I never consciously agreed to play. Quiet dominance isn't about power over others. It's about power over yourself. It's the ability to pause instead of react, to observe instead of fix, to withdraw function without withdrawing care. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. You are not obligated to remain who you were when your silence made other people's lives easier. Growth doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like restraint, like choosing not to explain, like letting patterns reveal themselves when you stop holding them together. And if that shift creates distance, confusion, or discomfort, it doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. It may simply mean the system is recalibrating without your unpaid labor. If you've listened to this and felt something stir, recognition, relief, even resistance, that's worth paying attention to. Those feelings aren't a call to act impulsively. They're an invitation to reflect. Ask yourself, where am I overfunctioning? Where am I being relied on instead of respected? And what would change if I stopped making myself so easy to lean on? You don't need to answer those questions out loud. You don't need to announce your clarity. You don't even need to change anything immediately. Sometimes, the most powerful shift begins with noticing, and not rushing to correct what you notice. Before we end, I want to ask you something, and if you feel comfortable, I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized that the role you played in your family was quietly costing you more than you were willing to admit? And what happened when you finally stopped carrying it alone?